Hello and welcome to NAFA's webinar, Smart Mobility Institute, Session 2, Common Requirements from Fleet to Mobility. My name is Danelle Holberg and I am NAFA's meeting coordinator. Today's webinar will be moderated by David Hayward, manager with Deloitte Consulting LLP. Before we begin our webinar, I would like to go over a few housekeeping details. This session is being recorded, and a recording of the presentation will be available after the webinar. For those of you who may not be familiar with the GoToWebinar software being used for this webinar, please note that there is a question dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a question, please type in your question and submit it. The questions will be moderated during the webinar, but we will handle the bulk of the questions at the end of the presentation. At this point, I would like to turn things over to our moderator, David Hayward.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and you're very, very welcome to our second session in conjunction with Nexus and the Smart Mobility Institute 2020. It is my pleasure on behalf of NAFA and the NAFA Board of Directors to introduce to you Stephen Schuffs, who is the Chief Editor of Fleet Europe magazine. And he's going to introduce our panelists for the discussion today. Take it away, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thank you to the NAFA Association for setting up these webinar series with Smart Mobility and the Smart Mobility Institute. As David has mentioned, my name is Stephen Schuffs. I'm the Chief Editor of Fleet Europe, Global Fleet and Smart Mobility. And we are really happy that we are able to explain a little bit how we see, together with fleet managers that we have been talking to, the transformation from fleet to mobility. As David indicated, this is session 2. So we already had a first session that you can relive also online, in which we outlined a little bit the scope of mobility and the trends that we are seeing happening in Europe in terms of mobility. Today, we are going to take a look into the common requirements. And why the common requirements? Because we see that multinational companies may have different core businesses, they may have different fleet strategies, and they perhaps also have a different, let's say, maturity curve when it comes to the development of new initiatives around mobility. But in that diversity, we have found that there still is a common ground. And so there are common requirements when you go from fleet to mobility. And in this webinar, we would like, with 2 experts, to deep dive into the how and the what of those common requirements. So I am not going to do this webinar all by myself. Normally, indeed, you will see now on the screen that we have invited 2 true experts. So we have Yves Helven, who is our mobility expert at Nexus Communication and Smart Mobility. And we have Pim De Weerd, who is global lead in mobility at Philips, the company that you all know. And so he already has made some progress in the transformation from fleet to mobility. And first, Yves is going to detail a bit about what are the essential steps in setting up a mobility program. And after that, Pim De Weerd of Philips will detail how he sees the mobility program within Philips, but also the fact that with some other fleet managers in Europe, he has started an exercise around those common requirements to make sure that in the end, they can come up with, let's say, sort of a standardized basic that can then also count for the building of the mobility program in his and other companies. So without further ado, I would like now to introduce the agenda. So first we will have the Smart Mobility Institute. We started it last year because we saw that it's really important that fleet and mobility managers, procurement managers, but also people from HR, facilities in different categories, that they can come together and discuss the topic around mobility. They can share their vision and see if there is somehow let's say, an exchange in expertise that makes it possible for them to move faster in terms of the transformation from fleet management to mobility management. And as you see, the Smart Mobility Institute is based around best practice sharing, learning, panel discussions, and inspiring case studies. And I'm sure that the story of Yves Helven, but also of Pim De Weerd, will be inspiring for you. Okay, so if we then look a little bit, we started it last year, and we had already different sessions, and you see that the companies that are involved in those sessions are really the biggest multinational companies that we have in Europe and also across the globe. And we see really that now there is this appetite to move from the traditional classic car-centric approach to the more mobility-oriented user approach. And that's also why we see for the future, even within this particular situation of COVID-19, we still see that there is a need to discuss how new flexible mobility solutions can add value to your current fleet management. Okay. So this is the second session. We had one session already last month, and this session will not be the final one. So also please register for the upcoming sessions that you see on the screen on the 25th of June and the 27th of August, because in total the 4 sessions, the 4 Smart Mobility Thursdays, will form, let's say, one nice homogeneous package, and you will learn how to go from fleet to mobility. So thank you very much again to NAFA, and then I would like now to introduce Yves Helven, our smart mobility expert, who is going to unravel the essential steps about setting up a mobility program. Yves, hello. There is something with your audio, Yves.
Hello, Stephen. Yep, thank you for your introduction. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, welcome to the second Digital Smart Mobility Institute, and thank you for joining. My name is Yves Helven. In this presentation, we will be discussing 2 topics. The first one is the reason why companies have started integrating mobility solutions. The second part of the presentation is an overview of what corporate mobility looks like from an operational point of view and from a policy point of view. You'll see that mobility for a professional client is very different from mobility for consumers. Taking an Uber as a private person is extremely easy, but when all of your employees want to use Uber, you need an infrastructure. It's this infrastructure that we'll be discussing. We will demonstrate that one of the hurdles that enterprise clients need to overcome is translating a consumer service into a corporate offering. Let's start with the problems that corporate fleet managers in Europe want to solve with mobility. Okay, seem to have a bit of a problem with the clicker. Okay, thank you. What you see on the screen is the situation of most of the corporate fleets today. It's what we call the dedicated car, where a fixed link is established between the employees and their cars. Especially in Europe, where we have a lot of benefit cars, employees are able to choose the car brand, the model, the engine, and the equipment. Employees refer to their company car as my car rather than as a car. It's a model that has worked for years and that is now being challenged by a variety of new parameters. It starts with congestion. Even if commuting is, strictly speaking, not a corporate concern, it's becoming more obvious that it has an impact on employee efficiency and also on the employee's work-life balance. Some analysts have attempted to quantify the cost of congestion in the US and landed on an amount of 87 billion USD per year that directly or indirectly is impacting your P&L. The second problem that European fleet managers need to solve is pollution. Countries with focus on emissions, which is the case for almost all EU countries, are asking corporate fleet owners to prepare mobility plans with guaranteed emission reductions. In order to obtain tax benefits or governmental subsidies or even win governmental tenders, companies need to demonstrate a strong emission policy. Reducing pollution is therefore not an ideological initiative, but much more an economic imperative. In addition, European cities are actively banning cars from city centers. This happens gradually, where cities either lock out cars in certain streets or only admit clean cars. To give you some examples, Berlin has closed down some of the major roads for diesel cars. Amsterdam is returning some of its city center streets to pedestrians and cyclists. Brussels has turned almost its entire city center into a car-free zone. This trend is not unique, and as a combination of objectives, incentivize cities to keep cars out of the centers. These incentives are pedestrian and cyclist safety, preservation of historic city centers, pollution, and congestion. It's fair to say that European cities are being revamped to become better places to live. Next, we have taxation on company cars, which is increasing both for the employer and for the employee. Cars used to be better than salary from a money perspective. For each dollar of salary, a European employee receives roughly 40 to 50 cents, whilst for each dollar of company car, the employee would receive about 70 cents of value. These tax advantages are slowly disappearing and various tax incentives are being cancelled. Some countries link tax rates to emissions, other to catalog prices, other again to the distance between home and office. But in almost all cases, companies are paying more tax on company cars and employees are sacrificing a bigger portion of their salaries to their company cars. High up on the agenda of every fleet manager, especially nowadays, are savings. Mobility is almost always transaction-based, whilst vehicle leasing is long-term and less flexible. As a general trend, the average need for professional car miles is decreasing because most companies are transitioning to digital business models. Less miles means less need for cars. Therefore, savings can be generated by implementing mobility. This is a typical European thing. The public opinion is not a big fan of company cars. There are an increasing number of news articles, social media posts, and political discussions that blame company cars for congestion and parking problems. Politics tend to follow and respond to media hypes and have started to duplicate conversations that go against company cars. And next, it turns out that younger people are no longer interested in benefits that are not flexible or not customizable. Company car is considered as an inflexible benefit, and especially the younger employee population that lives in urban areas is not motivated by a car benefit when it's not possible for them to park the car or when they prefer to receive salary or better benefits instead. Finally, and this refers to an item that we mentioned before, digitized industries need less cars and see no need to provide dedicated cars. The demand for mobility solutions in Europe is 100% in line with the level of digitization of a company. Old school enterprises hold on to the company car, modern companies consider alternatives. Taking into consideration all these new imperatives, the dedicated company car that we have known for many decades turns out to be rigid, inadequate, and obsolete. So, based on the problem statements, you might think that mobility is the ultimate solution for European clients. Actually, no. As we discussed in the previous Smart Mobility Institute, mobility is in different stages of maturity across Europe, and its supply chain is far from being strong enough to satisfy the corporate needs. Mobility as an alternative to car works well in cities, but is still insufficient in most suburbs and in the countryside. Also, corporate mobility needs a complex infrastructure, which is not always offered by mobility supplier. Nevertheless, even if mobility is not the ultimate solution today, it is evolving fast and it's worth preparing for. We will now go through the setup of corporate mobility. In the first part of this section, I will explain all the operational components that corporate clients need to put in place an offer of mobility. In the second part, we'll be talking more about policies. Let's start with the verticals. This is about solution integration from the bottom, which is the user experience, all the way up to integration into ERPs, such as SAP, payroll, expense note systems, and tax systems. On the first level, we find the options that enterprise clients need for a mobility program. As we mentioned before, the company car is still an important component of corporate mobility. It's also interesting to mention here that it's not that easy to remove a company car from an employee in Europe, simply because it is, for many European employees, part of their employment contract. The second component of a mobility strategy is the on-demand fleet, commonly referred to as pool cars. Because the utilization rate of dedicated cars is decreasing, companies have started to share vehicles amongst employees. This allows them to optimize the utilization of their assets and generate savings. It's an important first step in moving away from dedicated solutions. On-demand or carpooling offers many advantages. Fleets can be electrified faster, orders can be consolidated, fleet management can be entirely digitized, and it's overall a more efficient way to manage car fleets. The corona pandemic is slightly changing the corporate opinion about shared vehicles, but nonetheless, especially as savings are becoming more essential, it's likely that sharing will make it back to the top of the agenda. The next solution to be integrated is micromobility. Especially in summertime, people prefer to take a regular bike or an e-bike to work, and many companies are offering some kind of a bike solution to their employees. Micromobility also receives strong governmental support, and in some cities, companies are heavily subsidized to offer bikes to their employees. The next solution to add to the mobility basket are car-centric solutions. These are taxis, limo services, ride-hailing, ride-sharing, car-sharing, and short-term rental. These solutions are becoming less popular, mainly because of their pricing, but also because they're less adequate in congested cities. Nevertheless, it's still a very popular option to go to the airport or to do trips that would take longer by public transport. Now we come to the last mobility solution. Now we come to the last mobility solution, and at the same time the backbone of European mobility, public transport. This means trains, trams, buses, subways, shuttles, but also peripheral solutions offered by public transport providers, such as train plus bike or train plus parking. This completes the first level of corporate mobility. This is also the only thing that corporate and consumer mobility have in common, the solutions themselves. Parking and flexible office space can also be added to this level, but are not always within the scope of fleet and mobility managers. Now we'll have a look at the next layers of corporate mobility. What we're going to discuss from now onwards is the infrastructure that separates consumer mobility from corporate mobility. Let's start with the vehicle operating system. Managing one car is simple, managing 1,000 cars is complex. We typically leave much of the operational hassle to our leasing companies, but we still need to manage employees, costs, invoice, and give approvals. European companies use a variety of operational support solutions, going from fully outsourced management to software for in-sourced management. Now, when we look at mobility solutions, corporate clients are not willing to deal with a multitude of vendors, nor with the additional workload of thousands of transactions. Corporate clients want aggregation, ideally one super application that offers all mobility solutions on a single mobile phone screen. At this point in time, the ultimate aggregator does not exist, and other integration solutions are being promoted on the market. Those who were attending the first session of the Smart Mobility Institute might remember the sponsor of that session, CMAT, which is a solution that offers integration rather than aggregation. Here we see the first layer of corporate mobility infrastructure. This level is all about reducing the complexity of managing large volumes of assets, transactions, or suppliers. Now let's get into the third level of the infrastructure. This is more about controlling operations and regulating how the different tools are utilized. This includes vehicle sourcing, policy management, mobility budgets, and invoice control. It defines essentially what the employee receives and how to control it. For instance, you might give your employees $100 of mobility budget, but you need to have processes and policies in place to allocate this budget or stop the budget when employees leave the company. It's at this level that you find your policies as well as your fleet and mobility managers. So here we have the 3 levels of corporate mobility into one visual. It reflects the corporate desire to offer as much as possible to the employee, but with a strong and preferably centralized operational control on top. Transaction management is the final level of corporate mobility. Let me give you an example. An employee takes a 5-mile Uber ride in the morning to go to the office. Then the same employee takes a 5-mile ride to visit a client in the afternoon. In the evening, the same employee takes again a similar 5-mile ride to buy dinner. From a mobility point of view, it's the same type of transaction, but from a tax and payroll point of view, these are 3 entirely different transactions. The first is commuting, is taxed as income. The second one is only cost for the company, and the third one needs to be recharged in full to the employee's payroll. Multiply these scenarios of up to 8 transactions a day with 1,000 employees, and you end up with an operational nightmare. This is why corporate clients want to see automation of transaction management and integration into ERPs, payroll systems, expense note systems, and so on. Here is the entire mobility pyramid, whereby the bottom level is what we see on the streets, and the 3 top levels are what the corporate client needs to make it work in an enterprise environment. Finally, we'll be spending a few minutes on the horizontal aspects of mobility and give you an idea how to tie everything together from a policy point of view. Mobility is not only about giving employees access to different solutions, it needs to be framed in a way that employees know what to use, how to use it, and how much they can spend. In the next slide, I'll be showing you 1 old and 3 new policies that we are starting to see with European companies. In each of the slides, you'll see in black which components of the mobility pyramid are activated for each policy, and in gray, the components that are dormant for these policies. The car policy is the most common policy. Companies have been writing car policies for the last 50 years, and these are still valid, even when flexible solutions are being offered. We do see that car policies are evolving. A good example is eligibility. Companies are becoming more careful to give cars and are no longer linking a company car to the level of the employees, but rather to the job need. Also, companies are reviewing policies for new employees, and we're starting to see more flexible benefits instead of company cars. The first novelty is the commuting policy. When companies take up their responsibility to reduce traffic or implement sustainable solutions, they need to find and propose alternatives for commuters. Companies understand that congestion costs money, and they also understand that employees who are commuting by car cause pollution. Previously, commuting was not considered as part of corporate responsibility, but this has completely changed now. If at the same time savings are being made by reducing parking space and efficiencies are realized because employees are less stressed at work, it's a welcome added benefit. The next policy is the private mobility policy. We find this especially at companies that incentivize their employees to exchange their company cars for a mobility budget. Employees can use mobility solutions in the evenings or in weekends and receive a budget for this. The taxation rules for mobility budgets are changing in a way that these budgets are subject to lower taxation than salary, which makes it more interesting than a cash allowance. Finally, we have the functional mobility policy. This policy governs how employees visit clients, suppliers, events, and other offices. It's often not exclusive in the sense that even employees with company cars can have access to mobility options at the condition that it's more efficient or greener or cheaper than using the car. In this slide, I've grouped again the policies and the solutions that are activated. Please remind that this is not an exact science, it's rather a snapshot of what European companies are offering to their employees. Finally, let's go back to the problems that European companies want to solve with mobility. A good commuting policy reduces congestion and emissions. Pool cars generate savings. Mobility solutions attract younger generations. Finally, mobility means innovation and future-proofing. It works very well as a flexible benefit and is compatible with digital business models. Nonetheless, you'll appreciate that we're still a few years away from a full transition to mobility. The corona pandemic is also slowing down the rollout of mobility, especially because employees are afraid to use public transport or shared solutions. This concludes my part of the presentation. I hope you found this interesting, and I already wish you all the best with your future mobility initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yves Helven. Thank you. And thank you also for highlighting the building blocks of setting up a mobility program. And ladies and gentlemen, as you have seen, so it's not a goal, let's say, that you really go immediately from the company car to the integrated, wonderful mobility solution for each and every employee. There are some building blocks, there are some steps that you can follow, and there is also sort of a maturity curve that probably needs to be followed across the organization and even within the countries that you are responsible for. And one of those companies that already a few years ago has realized that just zooming in on company cars will not be efficient anymore in the future, will not attract new people, is not cost efficient anymore, is Philips. We all know Philips. They have a global fleet and they have quite some activities both in North America and in Europe. And a few years ago, they even decided to rename the function of the global fleet manager into the global mobility manager, which underlines already the importance of the topic for a multinational organization as Philips. And today we have with us Pim De Weerd, who is the global mobility manager, and he already started with the exercise of transforming, or should I say, trying to transform the fleet management into a mobility management, because also, as Yves Helven has pictured, is not something that you can do really straightforward, easy, and so on. So it might take some steps, and Pim already started that journey, and he will be sharing with us today what he has been doing at Philips, why he has been doing it, and how, together with some other fleet managers and mobility managers, they are trying to see what is the common ground in building an efficient mobility program. And so, Pim, we are really happy that you have found the time between all the mobility actions that you are taking at Philips to share with us your vision around mobility.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the introduction. So, yeah, let me share with you the journey so far and why we started to move from fleet to mobility management. When I introduced it 3 years ago, I immediately got full support by senior management, and it is because I embedded it in innovation and sustainability into my strategy. And innovation and sustainability is what really matters at Philips. Innovation is what the founding fathers, the Philips family, did 130 years ago, and what makes us still relevant today, as we have the ambition to improve the lives of 3 billion people through innovation. Secondly, sustainability is fully embedded into our corporate strategy. We support and are committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we incorporate sustainability in how we drive our business. So with mobility management, we anticipate also on everything what's going on currently in the automotive industry with connected, electric, autonomous and shared cars. We see opportunities for more flexible, sustainable and cost-efficient mobility solutions. And now what's my scope? So I have cover all ground transportation. Worldwide, we have more than 12,000 cars. We on an annual level have approximately 65,000 rental car transactions, 98,000 train tickets, and more than 123,000 taxi rides. So, as I said, innovation and sustainability is key to drive and transform to mobility management, but also, as partly already reflected by Yves, workforce of the future has different needs. We move from ownership to usership. The ownership of the car is not critical anymore. That's important. We need the workforce needs access to mobility. Furthermore, we want to simplify travel administration. All the reimbursement of travel expenses is considered perceived as a hassle, and we want to further simplify that. And we want to further reduce the total cost of mobility with a mobility budget approach. So how to start? So first of all, team up with your key stakeholders. You need to involve HR, you need to involve sustainability, finance, tax, and then definitely you need a sponsor. It will be difficult to start if you don't get budget and can claim resources. So find an executive sponsor, and then start local. That's what we do, because right now mobility, you cannot do this on a global regional level. It's still very different on local level with different providers, different infrastructure, different taxation. Then start a pilot. We started in the Netherlands with a pilot for car sharing and a mobility card, and this will give you insights on whether it will change certain travel behavior, what's still missing, and how it's valued by your employees. Then when there's you have done these things and you have these insights in combination with service, then start a project. That's what we also started in the Netherlands, and then we created a framework which we call the House of Mobility. And within this framework, which is built on 3 pillars, on flexibility, sustainability, and cost effectiveness, we set targets on each of these building blocks. So with regards to flexibility, it's relevant to increase the employee satisfaction. With sustainability, we have the ambition to go to a zero-emission fleet by 2025, and the overall program should be cost neutral. So then when we kicked off the project with this framework, we dig deeper into the data, and then we identified personas to further understand what is their mobility need. Then you see that already 50%, close to 50% of the workforce, the short track and the long track commuter, only commutes. There's zero business travel for them. Then you have a small percent or a percentage which occasionally travels, up to 6 times a year a travel expense. And then you see close to 30%, and that's the mobile worker. That's the interesting one. Has a lot of different travel behavior with different modalities and works at different locations. So that's where we see opportunities for further optimization. So for the mobile worker, we are now looking to introduce a mobility platform where it will take away all the hassle on expense administration. He does no longer need to go to different channels to book his taxi ride, apply for a train card, or book his rental car. So all via a one-stop shop, and ultimately also introducing a mobility budget. So then when we have now been scanning the market, as Yves already said, we see that the ultimate aggregator is not there yet. It does not exist yet. the Amazon.com for mobility is not there yet. So so what we now do is we team up with other large corporates like Accenture and Microsoft, and we listed common requirements for a platform, and to make sure that we can accelerate this development of a platform when we go out together to the market and list our requirements. This was also shared during a Smart Mobility Institute session earlier this year in Brussels. And yeah, I'll highlight a few of them to give you an understanding what we mean with these requirements. For example, preference management engine. We want that the employee can identify what's important to them: vitality, sustainability, time, comfort, effort. And then the platform can advise whether you should take the bike, walk, or take the train, or the car, or a rental car, or an electric car, depending on your preferences. Another important feature is single sign-on. Not that you have to go and create and register your credit card details, your driver's license, passwords, and so on each and every single application. No, it should be a single sign-on for all mobility services. So this platform therefore should also integrate all these services like Uber, like rental car or public transport, all on the one platform. And then with regards to artificial intelligence, we want to have machine learning that it will recognize your travel patterns and also connects with your Outlook, with your calendar, and will start to give you travel advice, saying like, hey, today there are traffic jams. We recommend you to take the train instead of the car. So that are the type of things we have been listing as common requirements, and the next step is to go out to the market to see who's able to deliver this to us in the near future. So with that, thank you, and I hand it back to Stephen now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pim. Hopefully you can continue the journey soon, and you are able also with participants of the Smart Mobility Institute to deliver, let's say, that common requirements grid and to go out into the market, because there is still, as both expert speakers have mentioned, some let's say stimulus of the market that needs to be done. So and we are hoping, of course, that also throughout the next sessions we can deliver information on how we can guide you to a more optimized mobility management. I'm looking at David Hayward of NAFA. David, we are now going to start, I think, the Q&A. And so if I'm correct, people, attendees, they can ask the question via the chat function. Is that correct?
That's correct, Stephen. We have an actual section called questions where you can go in and type your question in. And then I will moderate the questions and consolidate them and ask them to the group.
Okay.
I have one myself to ask to start kicking things off. So we've talked about fleet as a category. What other categories should we consider when setting up a mobility program? Perhaps Yves, you would like to answer that first question.
Yeah, thanks, David, for the question. There's a couple of approaches to that particular question. The first thing is to look at HR. What we see is that HR, or the way that Total Rewards, Comp and Ben approaches employee benefits, is changing dramatically. We come from a time where an employee would have a fixed pension fund, a fixed health insurance, and a fixed salary, and a fixed number of days of holidays, and so on. We see that is changing into more flexible benefits. So the first thing is, and this is also where mobility sits really well, where it behaves really well, mobility can act as one of the flexible benefits that HR is offering to their employees. So that's the first link, perhaps, between mobility and HR. Then we can also look at facilities, and especially right now where employees are working from home and employees are indicating that they want to continue work from home even once the pandemic is over. There might be less of a need for square meters, for office space, basically. So mobility is then also one of the tools that can make it possible for employees to facilitate that working from home versus working from the office. So that's perhaps a link between mobility and facilities. And then obviously, I think the main link is between the business itself, your sales departments, your marketing departments, people who actually in the past needed to go out and visit clients, visit stores, visit vendors and so on. As businesses are digitizing, we see that there's less of a need for company cars. So the business itself, your sales departments and your marketing departments will basically drive the need for flexible solutions rather than fixed solutions. So that's, from a very high, from a helicopter view, how mobility can integrate with different categories within the company.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question comes from Stacey Kroger. How do you suggest a company that travels mostly in rural areas look at rolling out a mobility type platform? That's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a contradictory one, right?
Yep.
I think, and Pim, complete me if I'm wrong. Right now, it's a big challenge. So what we've seen, especially in Europe over the last couple of decades, is that public transport has been divesting rather than investing. And you go back to, let's say, Belgium, Netherlands in the 50s and 60s, we had an extremely good coverage of buses and train stations across the country. And then gradually, as people stopped using those trains and buses, many of those stations basically closed down. And we see that public transport providers are behaving like corporate companies, and they're investing in their main lines rather than in peripheral lines. So as a result of that evolution, we see that there is not enough coverage for rural areas with public transport. So this is the first point. What we see now as well is that this is picking up again. We see that shuttle services are investing in filling up the gaps that have been created by public transport over the last decades. So there's this new business like Helven in the United States that are kind of working very well together with public transport and that are making the public transport network bigger again. So that's the first point. The second point comes down to your business model, right? If you have people driving around in rural areas, first question is always, do these people, in the future, with a more digital business model, will they still need to drive around as much as they do today, right? And then the third point is obviously the maturity of the mobility ecosystem itself, which is, in its infant stage. It's not even an adolescent, it's an infant, and that will grow as well. So the ideal world is the autonomous vehicle that can drive around and that you can order. But until that point, it's mostly, it's a little bit of a waiting game and see who is going to be the first one to offer services in rural areas. As a client or as a corporate fleet manager, I think it's important to demonstrate to mobility suppliers that it's worth investing in rural areas. And that's also some information that they miss.
Very good, thank you, Yves. Here's an interesting question regarding law enforcement agencies. Is there a mobility application for something like a sheriff's office to cover a large county? Or is there a law enforcement agency that we can look to for ideas in terms of mobility for law enforcement agencies? It's a, but that's a very interesting one. I think we may need to take that one offline. I'm not familiar myself with any law enforcement agent implemented any programs. So I think I thank Tim Coxwell for the question. Tim, we'll do our best to follow up, and if we can. What I would encourage you to do, Tim, if I make a shameless plug for NAFA's communities, there is a law enforcement communities page, and you can ask the question there, where perhaps some of our NAFA colleagues will have some ideas for you. I'll move on, if you don't mind, to a question from Thibaut Allen. This is a good one. He says in Europe, but I'd like to expand it to the world, or to global. How do you see the evolution of rental and leasing companies transforming to mobility aggregators? So what's that evolution look like?
This is a good one for you, I guess.
Yeah, well, we don't see that much of leasing companies moving towards mobility aggregators. Their core business will remain the car, and there are others who are better or more advanced in becoming such a platform aggregator than the leasing company. With rental car companies, some have the ambition to take that role, but I also I haven't seen one yet who can manage it all. Maybe if you like to add something to that.
No, I completely agree with you. We do see that ambition, but as long as their business model is basically leasing companies are sourcing machines, right? They make their money from volume deals with insurance companies, tire companies, automotive providers, and so on, so on. So as long as their business model is based on revenues coming from the automotive industry, their only incentive to offer mobility is to keep a client.
Yeah.
And as long as they don't change their business models, they're going to be focusing on providing metal. So I completely agree with Pim.
Pim, I have another question for you, and this one is around change management. How do we overcome management and employee resistance as that transformation from fleet to mobility takes place?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So indeed, because that was one of my pitfalls when I started to sell this story internally, and then it was, oh, this is procurement. Where's the catch? You're only after savings, after cost savings. So you really need to involve all your stakeholders and start questioning what they find important. What's their vision on mobility? What are their concerns? And then come to an aligned vision, like I showed in the framework, and then start working from there. But also we involve the employees, the workforce, with sounding board sessions where we test with them what's relevant to them, what do they find important, whether we have a bike scheme or other solutions like car sharing or a mobility card.
Very good. And then related to that, what are some of the recommendations you might have for pilots and tests of the mobility solution as you evolve with the
Yeah. Again, starting off, well, what you think is relevant for your company? We wanted to see with a mobility card to test it, whether it changes your behavior. So start with a small group where you think, hey, these are frequent travelers, and let them test it from different department, different disciplines. So we involved HR, people from finance, procurement, different disciplines to test it, and then gather their feedback, whether they shifted to not use the car and travel by train more, or more frequently using other modes of transport, testing an Uber. When you simplify or facilitate this in a better way.
Very good. one more question here. What in your opinion, Pim, I'm going to stick with you, is the biggest mistake international fleet managers and their organizations make with the setup and building of a mobility program?
Yeah, one of the pitfalls of mistakes, what I said, that I really push for it. You really need to make sure that it's supported by all the different functions. And you need patience. This is something which will not fly fast. You know, you need a lot of patience to get things on the road, and it's not easy. It's complex. Different disciplines to be involved: tax, data privacy, legal. Yeah, it's not an easy one, but so that's what you should not underestimate when you start such a project.
David, can I perhaps add to that just one question, perhaps for both of the expert speakers, related to the pandemic that we are now living in and hopefully coming out of in the weeks and months to come. Do you think that this will be more of an obstacle to continue mobility management, or will it just be perhaps the accelerator of new mobility initiatives, because there are perhaps new opportunities related to the situation that we are now living in and that we are now used to, like working from home, digitization. We see that we don't need all those parking spots and so on. What is your experience, Pim? And perhaps also Yves, in brief, how do you see that evolution?
A good question, and a very actual question, of course, and then we addressed it internally recently. Even last week we had a steerco with how we continue with future mobility, and then I get mixed messages. HR sees the opportunity. Now is the momentum to further accelerate because we start working more from home. So we move away from a fixed allowance and go to a variable allowance based on actual commuting, actual costs. So then there's definitely the opportunity to accelerate on this. But finance gives you a different message, saying, yeah, this is not our first priority now. We have other concerns, restructuring, and all other kind of concerns. Where we and then this becomes not priority number one. So yeah, depends on who you have with you, which stakeholder you talk to, who can support you in this journey.
Yves?
Yeah, so first, completely underwrite what Pim is saying. You've got a different opinion. Some say, well, this is the perfect time. The other ones say, oh, let's stop with this as soon as we can. What we know, however, is that the company car is in danger. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the company car is in danger. And that danger comes from one side, from the fact that people are working from home and going to work from home more often. The second point is, and I think this is my personal opinion, but I think it's something that will happen very soon. Most governments have invested huge amounts of money to counter the effects of the pandemic, and that money will have to be recovered one way or another. And I think that the tax on company cars is going to be one of the items that is going to increase. So I kind of foresee in many European countries a higher taxation on company cars. So essentially, we've got this combination where people need less cars, perhaps, or at least from a mathematical point of view, and cars are becoming more expensive from a tax point of view. So I think this will drive some kind of this can be potentially a push towards mobility. The second thing that we know is that HR is focusing right now on employee wellness, right? So HR is focusing very much on how the employee feels, how they can improve the employee situation, and so on. So basically, everything that's relating to pandemic is either business, how much do we sell, and how much does it cost to sell? But the second focus is purely on HR, and HR is going to use that opportunity to push their agenda of flexible benefits. I'm pretty sure of that. So HR is, is kind of ruling right now.
Mhm.
So if you put everything together, I think there's a strong argument that maybe not mobility will, mobility will pick up more, but at least that company cars, or the focus on company cars, will decrease. And that creates a gap, and that gap needs to be filled up. Mobility might be a good agent to fill up that gap.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, David.
Okay, we're coming close to time, so I think this will probably be our last question, and it's for Pim. Outside of the EU, which countries or in which countries did your mobility program take shape?
Yeah, actually, it's the US, where we started last year to also set up a house of mobility and look into opportunities like ride-hailing with Uber and the lifts which you have in the US, and also look at alternatives to the company car for those who do not travel that much, who do not make the minimum business mileage, where we say, hey, we shift to our alternative platform packages.
Very good, excellent. Well, like I said, I think we're close to time, so we'll wrap up. Again, on behalf of the entire membership of NAFA, we want to thank Nexus Communications for this wonderful partnership, and a special thank you to Pim De Weerd and Yves Helven for their expertise, and Stephen for being a great MC as always. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
We do have, Steve, perhaps you can tell us about the next session that's coming up in August, I believe, or is it August?
June, I think.
Oh, I'm skipping one. June.
I think the next one is on Thursday, 25th of June. June 25 is the next one.
Excellent.
And then we will talk about the convergencies between fleet, travel, and HR. So we discussed already the importance of engaging different stakeholders into the mobility program and the mobility setup. So this is what we are going to do in the next session, to look a little bit at how the different main categories in your business see mobility. And then the fourth session is in August, where we will work on what we have seen before. So thank you very much also from Smart Mobility and Nexus, and to everyone, stay safe and stay well.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.